I'm Ellen Blue. I'm the Biggs Professor of the History of Christianity and United Methodist Studies at Phillips Seminary in Tulsa. I'm also an ordained member of the Louisiana Conference of the United Methodist Church. And so when Katrina made landfall in 2005, I really started gathering materials for my book, In Case of Katrina, Reinventing the Church in Post-Katrina New Orleans, the next day. It was very personal to me because New Orleans is my home, and my son was in the city as a first responder. So the things that happened were very intense and very meaningful to me. But being in Tulsa most of the year gave me just enough objectivity to be able to write about it in a way that someone who faced day after day after day living in the post-storm city, I think probably could not have done. Katrina made landfall on August 29th, 2005, and the storm actually had turned a little bit away from the city. So we thought everything was okay, but the storm surge pushed water up through Lake Pontchartrain, and the flood walls that protected the city broke. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, when the flood walls were put in place, had not properly overseen the construction. And for whatever reason, incompetence or graft, we don't know why, but they did break. And water came into the city so that 80% of it was flooded, up to a depth of 10, 12, and even deeper levels of water. And that water was not just flood water, but was full of chemicals and toxic waste of all kinds. And it remained in the city for 3 weeks. Because New Orleans is below sea level, the water had to be pumped back out. And so after people were rescued from the city, the Corps took quite some time to get the water out. As people were finally allowed to come back in and just take a quick look at what happened to their property, they then had to leave the city again. And it was quite a long time before people could come back and begin to restore things. This is another controversial aspect of it. Poor people were delayed longer before they could come back into the city for certain sections. And it was a terrible failure of government at all levels. For the church specifically, we had, through Katrina and another storm that made landfall about 3 weeks later, we had 70 churches in the United Methodist Church that could not reopen. And we had 90 pastors who were displaced. Without their congregations functioning, there was no one to pay their salary, to pay their benefits, and so forth. And as United Methodists, we are a connectional denomination, which means we're obligated to one another. If an autonomous congregation didn't have enough people come back with enough money, their church didn't reopen. And if they did, it did reopen. But United Methodists had to be accountable to one another. Furthermore, we had much more diversity than most mainline congregations. There are only a few mainline churches and other denominations, whereas we had a great number, and about half of the ones that were down were African American membership, and about half of the ones that were down were Anglo membership. There was also a Latina congregation and a Korean congregation. So the question of how we would devote resources and try to achieve any level of justice in such a situation was extremely complex, very complicated. And the issue of what it would look like to have justice is one thing, and then the question of how to achieve it is yet another. The first thing that everyone thinks of when I talk about this topic is disaster response. And the idea of how did the churches participate in getting food to people who needed food, water to people who needed water. And then in the long term, how we helped people rebuild their homes and restore their property. And that's important, and we did a good job with it. But that's not what the book is about, because it's very predictable that, of course, the church should be involved in such an endeavor. And we actually did a very good job of that. What was not predictable was how we were going to make decisions about how to make decisions about pouring resources in and deciding which churches would need to merge, which churches that were in trouble before the storm would need to close, which new ministries ought to be looked at. When you think about the people who had been living in exile all over the country, as they came home and discovered that everything in their life was gone, really, to drive around, it was difficult to find things, even if you lived in the city, because so many landmarks had been destroyed. I had a very difficult time taking a class I brought down to find my son's house. I couldn't find my son's house for a while. And in that kind of devastation and confusion, people wanted one thing that didn't change, and it should be my church. And so this need for sanctuary with a capital S, this idea of one place where there's comfort and stability, was a very real need. On the other hand, before the storm, people had said, oh gosh, yes, we could live out the claims of the gospel if only we didn't have this aging and deteriorating building that was built back in the 50s, and if only we weren't stuck in the situation we're in, then we could reach out to our neighborhood and our community. Well, suddenly that building is gone. And so you have an unprecedented need for sanctuary and an unprecedented opportunity for living out the gospel in ways that people had said we want to do before the storm. So this dilemma was the major challenge that the church faced, and it was the main thing that interested me from the day after landfall, how the church would respond to this opportunity and this drastic need that was just unprecedented. We were extremely fortunate to have a bishop and a provost who were wise enough and spiritual enough and mature enough to be able to say, we have no idea what to do. I can think of other bishops we had who would have known on day one exactly how to proceed, and indeed another denomination in the city, the Roman Catholics, did have that kind of leadership, and it was a disaster. But the United Methodists were able to say, we're going to try something and see how it works, and if it doesn't, we'll try something else. They created something they called a mission zone program in the city and grouped congregations together, with each zone having at least one Anglo church, at least one African American church, put a team of pastors in place that were going to represent different races, both genders, and as much diversity as possible within that team, and made the declaration, we're going to let decisions come from the ground up as much as possible. And it took a long time, and it was very messy. But it was an opportunity to see how collaborative leadership, how leadership that shared power, leadership that looked maybe more like New Testament kind of leadership would actually work. And it worked very well. So that was one big opportunity. There were also new ministries that developed, which would not have without the storm, including one merger of an Anglo congregation and an African American congregation, which now just has wonderful, vibrant worship and a great program. And I'm prepared to say they would never have merged without Katrina. And I know never's a long time, but that's how long I think it would have been before those two congregations merged. There are new ministries reaching out to young people in Central City, which is a particularly poor and dangerous part of the city. So the the necessity for various congregations to work in cooperation when before the storm, I don't think they even spoke to each other, really led to some productive and marvelous ministry that's going on in the city. What the church did, what the United Methodist Church did, we did very well. We didn't do it perfectly, but we did it well. Where we failed was, in my opinion, what we did not do, and that is to speak prophetically about issues in the city and in the larger nation. The helplessness that people can feel in such a situation is in part a theological understanding that whatever is what God intended, but it's also a feeling that a force of nature is something that we can't control. However, coastal erosion is very much a human phenomenon. Climate change, we know humans play a part in that. And if we had been more attentive earlier to the fact that barrier islands were eroding because of the activities of oil and gas companies, because of the fact that the river has been diverted, because of decisions that humans have made, then the effects of the storm would have been quite different than they were. And right now, we are still in the same position, in the same vulnerable position, and the church has not spoken about it. Yes, we were overwhelmed with our own needs and our own problems, but at the tables where people were working on the master plan for the city, at the tables where people are talking about how to deal in the future with coastal erosion, the church is simply absent. It's absent because no one thinks to invite us, but it's also absent because we haven't thought we ought to be there, and we haven't tried to get an invitation to those tables. And so for me, this failure to look at the larger picture and to add the moral authority that the church could have added to the immediate ideas of which parts of the city need help recovering, but now which activities for the prevention of climate change and coastal erosion should we be supporting? And of course, under the new administration, that's going to be more important than ever. And all the different ways that we need to address that, from how we do liturgy, what we talk about in church, to how we need to be organizing toward working on these causes. All of this lies in front of us. And first, just getting the church to recognize that we need to be part of it is the first hurdle, and then the actual doing of the work is the second.